This is the Russian oil price cap panel. Today we have, my name is John Bradley. I'm a shareholder in the Global Transportation Finance, Maritime and International Trade Practice Groups at Vedder Price here in New York. With us on the panel today at the far end is Claire McCleskey. Claire is the Assistant Director for Compliance at the Office of Foreign Assets Control. Next to Claire is Christos Papanicolaou. He is the Senior VP at SIMPSON, SPENCE & Young here in the United States and head of their Business Development Group. And sitting next to me is Dan Tadros. Dan is the CEO, Chief Operating Officer for Shipowners Claims Bureau, who most of you know is the manager for the American Club here in New York. Before we start, I thought it would be useful, Claire, if you could give us an overview of the Office of Foreign Assets Control. What is its mission? How is it organized, and how it does its business? Could you provide a little background for the group?
Sure, happy to. So the Office of Foreign Assets Control, actually, if you're interested in the history, kind of goes back to World War II and trying to make sure that the Nazis could not get control of the assets of the countries that Germany was conquering. So it's a very long and storied history. So OFAC is the sanctions authority of the United States. We're part of the Treasury. We're in terrorism and financial intelligence, which is a component of the Treasury that was founded after 9/11. So we administer the United States economic sanctions programs. So you're familiar, obviously, the embargo on Cuba, the sanctions on Iran, the Kingpin Act, so the drug trafficking sanctions going back to the 90s. So we're fundamentally, a national security component of the Treasury, and we implement U.S. sanctions.
And Claire, how is the office organized? I see you're in compliance. There's compliance, enforcement. Can you tell us a little bit about how it's organized?
Sure, absolutely. So broadly, we have the targeting component. So these are the folks that are actually, conducting the sanctions investigations and then issuing the listings that you see, the SDN list. We have licensing, which issues specific licenses for companies or individuals to engage in activity that would otherwise be prohibited by U.S. sanctions. We have the policy component, which is I was recently in when I interacted with many of you. And then we have compliance and enforcement. So I'm the head of OFAC compliance. We oversee the feedback line, the phone line, all the outreach with industry. When people have questions about OFAC sanctions, compliance is who you come to. And the administration of blocked assets, the millions, if not billions of dollars now that are blocked. And then finally, enforcement, so the civil enforcement component of OFAC when there's been an OFAC violation.
Great, thanks. So our topic today really begins with the invasion of Ukraine by Russia back in February 2022. And as everyone in this room knows, the U.S. government has supported Ukraine with military equipment and supplies in the defense of the country. And they have also adopted and implemented through OFAC and through the Bureau of Industry and Security a number of non-kinetic measures in the form of financial trade and economic sanctions, as well as export controls. And the story here with respect to the Russian oil price cap goes back to an executive order that was signed by President Biden in April of last year. And that executive order had a list of prohibitions, and one of them was the executive order prohibited the exportation, re-exportation, sale, or supply, directly or indirectly, from the United States or by a United States person, wherever located, of any category of services as may be determined by the Secretary of the Treasury in consultation with the Secretary of State to any person located in the Russian Federation, right? So at the time this executive order was signed, there had not yet been a determination. But this is the starting point. Claire, then take us from this executive order to where we are today.
Sure. So, over the last year, we've issued an unprecedented volume of sanctions against Russia. It's 2,500 new and amended listings just in the last year. But in terms of the price cap, last summer, we got to a point in which the administration realized we had two sort of fundamentally competing goals. One was, of course, to reduce the revenue that Russia was getting from energy. Russia's obviously a very oil-rich country, and its invasion had spiked prices in oil. And at the time, mid last year, I was at Houston for Sarah Week a couple weeks ago, and people were recalling that, last year people were saying oil was going to hit 150, right, after the invasion. I mean, people just projecting these insane oil prices. And Russia was going to profit from that. It was their war that spiked the price of oil, and it was the spiked price of oil that they were going to use to fund the continuing war. So we obviously had the objective of reducing the revenue that they were going to get from oil. At the same time, the EU had adopted a sanctions package, the sixth sanctions package, which included a suite of service bans related to the transport of Russian oil to third countries. And the US was very concerned that this was going to take a large volume of oil off the market, which would also lead to increases in prices, particularly in developing countries. So we developed the price cap as a way to try and achieve both of those competing goals, which is reduce Russia's revenue while at the same time keeping oil flowing. I will say people thought we were absolutely nuts. People thought it was a very bad idea, and I can appreciate why. But I think it's worth revisiting that we were operating in the space in which you had the sort of unstoppable force, right, of Russia's invasion of Ukraine with the immovable object of the EU's services ban, which was going to come into effect and which we were very concerned was going to spike prices. So that's sort of the background and the policy rationale for how we developed the price cap.
So the EU was going to go with an absolute ban.
A complete ban on services associated with the shipment of oil from Russia to anywhere in the world, because we had, the U.S. had already banned the import of Russian oil. The G7 had committed to banning the import of Russian oil. The EU was banning crude oil on December 5th and then products on February 5th. That was already in effect. But the EU had also committed, because of that's where a lot of these top services sit, right? So there was a really demand, from the EU of we need to do more on Russia. But with these services bans, we were just very concerned that too much oil was going to come off the market.
Can I jump in?
Yeah.
If you don't mind, John, let me jump in here. And I think what Claire brought up just now is really important for people to understand. Out the gate, the EU took the lead in sanctions, okay? And for those of you that may have heard me speak about this before, you may think it's like a broken record, but the EU came out with sanctions that were confusing, complicated, contradictory on all types of levels. And thank God that the United States took the lead when it came to the oil price cap, okay? Because that was a clear directive as to how we're supposed to deal with this, at least in the insurance industry. So we were very grateful for that, and I think that was a big part of, there was a concerted effort of the international group, which is the 12 P&I clubs in the world, went to Washington, met with Claire, with the Departments of State, OFAC, and we were able to explain to them the frustrations that we had because of the European Union's position on certain sanctions.
And Christos, tell us again, this all involves not imports into the EU or imports into the US. This whole program involves the carriage and transportation of Russian oil and products to other countries such as China and India, right?
Well,
what is the state of the trade right now?
It's really interesting to hear both Claire and Daniel on their perspectives because, it was very clear what you said as far as your goals to kind of match up with what Europe's doing and everything. But at the same time, it was very confusing for the commercial industry. People weren't sure what to do, when they could do it. And I think we talked about this briefly on a pre-call, where we all of a sudden had de facto sanctioning. People just saying, if it's an oil company saying, if it has a history of Russian trade, they didn't care if it was non-sanctioned or they just said, no, traded Russian certain history, so I'm not touching it. At the same time, there was confusion on P&I clubs. We talked about this too. Who could cover what? How can you get coverage? These attestations, what do they really look like? Are they true? What is a ship owner supposed to vet? In addition, what we've seen is people like with this de facto sanctioning and with the pipeline system within Europe being shut down, which was primarily all Russian, we've seen it now from a shipping side, and the tankers particularly. It has increased the ton miles of European demand. It's been great for the U.S. exports. We've seen longer ton miles coming out of here. So, John and I were talking about it earlier. If there's 1.5 ships for every carriage of oil, I'd say there's about 0.75 ships for every carriage of oil, which has, increased the tanker market, but at the same time, still increased confusion. The other side of it is this price cap is great. But you also have now, today, oil touched 64 because nothing to do with anything other than the banking crisis. And now we're seeing a price cap of 60 for
60
crude
for
oil.
crude.
So if you look at the way Brent and WTI sometimes trade at a discount, there's no real discount to the Russians on their price of oil. And just today, actually, I don't know if you guys read about this, but Russia overtook the Saudi Arabia for delivery of crude oil to China. They're delivering right now 1.94 million barrels per day, overtaking Saudi Arabia for the last umpteen years. So it's interesting to see the dynamic of what you're trying to do and what you're trying to do, Daniel, as far as where you're trying to implement. And I gotta agree with you wholeheartedly. It is so confusing. But it's also created like this trade and shipping right now that we don't see going away anytime soon. I actually want to ask you one question. Let's pretend tomorrow the war's over and the sanctions are in place. Where do you see sanctions going?
We've always been very clear, the power of U.S. sanctions is that they are reversible. They're designed to change people's behavior. They're not designed to punish, right? And so, in other sanctions programs, we tied sanctions relief to a change in behavior. You look at Venezuela, for example, we've been very clear that if the regime, re-enters negotiations with the opposition, we can offer sanctions relief. So I think, honestly, we don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about if the war ended tomorrow, just because unfortunately I don't think it's going to. But, if it did, then we would be in a whole new world where we would hopefully be able to, change our sanctions policy. But unfortunately,
Wouldn't there be a remunerations exercise and all that first?
You look at what we're doing on the sort of repo front, which is the task force to track down oligarch assets. It's kind of outside of OFAC's purview. I think it's sort of a larger G7 conversation, but I think there are a lot of conversations happening about Ukraine is going to need to rebuild. It's going to be extraordinarily costly.
Yeah.
And, where the money is going to come from that is an open question.
So what happened after Biden signed that executive order? Treasury had to come up with the types of services that would be covered by that executive order. And Treasury identified trading, commodities brokering, financing, shipping, insurance, reinsurance, what Dan does, flagging, and customs brokering. And within those covered services, OFAC then came up with these tiers of actors in their relationship to the actual movement of the oil, on the theory that all of these actors were needed in some manner, shape, or form in order to move the oil. And in the case of the marine insurers, including the P&I clubs, P&I insurance, marine insurance, hull insurance was critical, obviously, to the movement of ships, the financing of ships, the registration of ships. So Dan, when this first came across for you guys, tell us what your concerns were, how you interacted.
Well, actually, I'd like to believe that the whole reason why insurers and owners were placed in the lower tier 3 was because of all the discussions that the international group had with OFAC. Because when we first approached, not just OFAC, when we were talking to OFSI, which is the United Kingdom's equivalent of OFAC, or to DG FISMA, which is the European Union's equivalent, there was a lot of confusion as to all the different players in the shipping industry. So for example, we had to explain that a shipper did not mean the vessel owner. It really meant the supplier of the cargo. And that was something that, and again, I'm very grateful to OFAC and the U.S. government officials for actually listening to what we were telling them, not only as far as the players engaged, but also the difficulties that would arise if a vessel all of a sudden, mid-voyage, was declared to be carrying illegal cargo. What happens to the crew? What happens if there's an international incident, an oil spill? So they again heard us, and the United States regulations include a safe harbor, which allow for us to provide that emergency type of insurance. So in this aspect, as Tier 3, the P&I clubs, obligation is to receive attestations, which is a draft document letter type that was prepared by OFAC with contributions from industry. And that attestation comes into us every time a member is to carry Russian fuel.
So Dan, let me stop you there, because we're talking about maritime services. And in the case of an insurer, the service is the placement of insurance and the settling of claims, the handling of claims, correct? Is there anything else?
I mean, we provide loss prevention directives, we issue circulars updating our members on all facets of the law or other areas that might impact them.
But in terms of the policy clauses and the attestations that you require and that OFAC requires, what does OFAC expect and what do you provide or secure from your members? Do you get it on an annual basis, on a per shipment basis, on a per voyage? But how do you do that?
So I can't say what OFAC expects, and I'm hoping Claire will give us some light, shed some light on that. But as far as we understand, based here in the United States, and we're the only P&I club based here in the United States, our obligation is to receive an attestation from our member. Now, that could be in two different forms. It can come in one letter with a list of all the vessels that member believes are going to carry Russian oil products or petroleum products, or they can send us an attestation per voyage. And I believe that both have been acceptable based on the frequently asked questions that I've read from OFAC. There's a little twist to this for our European-based brethren clubs. Well, under the EU, there has to be a reasonable expectation by the club that the attestation is valid. Well, that adds something to due diligence that a club has to do that the United States does not impose on us.
Okay. Before I let Claire talk about this same subject, I want to know, let's say a member conducts 10 voyages, and voyage 4, they have carried oil in excess of the price cap. But a claim develops on voyage 8 where there's no violation. How is that handled?
As far as the claim is concerned?
Yeah.
Well, if the claim arose on voyage 8 and that was a perfectly legal carriage, there is no issue. If on voyage 4, the U.S. government or Europe or the United Kingdom declares that that was above the oil cap, then it's somebody's job to enforce that. So either the United States or the European Union or the United Kingdom is going to name that company, theoretically, an SDN, which would cripple them. Am I right about that?
Could be, yeah. We have a lot of options, I think. I mean, I would say on the sort of expectations front, we've been very clear that, P&I clubs, insurers, are Tier 3 actors and can actually just use a standard sanctions exclusion clause in an existing policy if they want as a way of complying with the price cap. And we've had folks even, share price cap specific exclusion clauses with us. So there's no expectation from OFAC's perspective that an insurer would be getting a per voyage attestation. If someone chooses to do that, obviously they can, but we understand, as Daniel said, based on engagement with the private sector, that that's not a sort of realistic expectation from a business perspective. We've been clear that, for example, a bank that's issuing a sort of general financing to someone, they don't need to get a sort of per purchase documentation because that's just not how like a revolving line of credit works. on sort of what happens if, something was carried above the price cap, as Daniel alluded to, the reason we have a general license, which is a public authorization, for something that would otherwise be prohibited for the price cap, is exactly so you don't have a situation in which sort of mid-voyage somebody comes off cover, where's the ship going to dock? You've got the crew, you've got, safety concerns. What if there's an oil spill and it turns out that was above cap oil? This was exactly the sort of nightmare scenario that the clubs were saying is, something could happen, there could be an accident, now you're telling us we can't pay the claim. So we've been very clear that when you're talking about, emergency environmental concerns, the payment of a claim to really an innocent third party, right? Somebody's going to come in and clean up the spill, is not prohibited by the price cap policy.
But that's a good point, Claire. And I wondered about this when I read the policy myself, because, okay, there are emergency situations involving pollution, collisions, et cetera. But let's say there was a violation and the insurance product is going to inure to the benefit of an innocent party like a seafarer. Is that covered, or how would that work?
It depends on exactly what it is. And what we've, the other thing we've said is, in the event that something like this happens, please come in to us, which we know that they will, right, because we've been working with them the whole time. We have specific licensing for this, and we've dealt with this in the past in scenarios in which maybe there's a sanctions prohibition, but someone needs a specific license. We have said, by the way, health insurance for seafarers, not covered. No price cap, implication for something like that. Medical insurance, people brought up the issues of what if there's like a medevac scenario and it turns out the crew was on a ship carrying above cap oil. Not at all prohibited by the price cap. But in the event that, let's say, for example, it came out in the press, which I think is honestly the most likely scenario given, there was reporting in the Financial Times this morning about some price cap voyages. If it comes out that something was above the cap and it's not an emergency situation and you're just trying to sort of resolve the issue, just come into OFAC and we can deal with that on a specific licensing front.
Can I add to that? Just
Yes,
on
please.
The licensing, sorry, Christos. On the licensing, so because, for example, the American P&I Club is based here in the United States, we have the ability to go into OFAC and request special licenses that allow us to do and cover certain aspects of trade. So we have various licenses in that respect. Sorry.
No, it's okay. It's actually in reference to you a little bit, because right now 25% of Russian oil is carried on, John and I were talking about this word earlier, the dark fleet, the shadow fleet, the gray fleet, whatever you want to call them. At the same time, they're covered by someone. Who, where, how, I don't know. But if Russia's exporting 4.9 million barrels per day, roughly, and that's 25% is 1.25. At some point, if there's an elision, a collision, something, how does the American P&I Club, how does a P&I Club handle it?
Well, we don't.
Yeah, but
Clearly, because an unintended result of these sanctions, if you will, has been the creation of this ghost fleet, this illegitimate fleet of primarily older tankers, which are going to be prone to incidents, that are not insured by Western insurers, okay? There are insurers, there's one out of Russia, there's one out of New Zealand, what I would call rogue insurers, because no one knows, do they have the financial wherewithal to cover a major claim? Nobody knows, and God forbid something like that happens, because there will be no Western insurers that will be able to get involved or that would want to get involved.
right, no, but if it's
So
with
that's
one
a
of your,
danger.
if it's an American P&I Club ship and a ghost ship, what happens then is, I guess, my question. You cover your own and
We would cover our own, and we would have to go to OFAC and get permission if covering our own meant we have to make payout
Salvage,
to
whatever,
third
yeah.
parties that.
You see, when I hear these terms, shadow fleet, ghost fleet, dark fleet, I think of evasion, which is a bedrock principle of OFAC. You can't evade sanctions. Is that an evasion tactic by going to an insurer in Russia, or what do you think?
This is, I think, a key point and something that's very unique to the price cap, unlike some other sanctions programs. I think one of the reasons that industry had such a strong negative reaction when we first described this is the history of Iran, the Iran sanctions, the Venezuela sanctions, sanctions in which it was a full-scale prohibition, do not do business, with this, and also there's a risk of secondary sanctions even on foreign financial institutions. The price cap is an unusual sanctions regime in which we're saying you can do this business as long as it's subject to certain conditions. What we've been very clear on is the price cap is fundamentally a service prohibition. So if someone wants to not touch G7 services, there's no prohibition, right? If somebody wants to use a Chinese company wants to use a Chinese ship and Chinese insurance, that's not what we would call evasion in the price cap context. When we talk about evasion of the price cap, what we really mean is somebody is lying to a Western insurer, right? Someone has gone to a Greek ship owner and provided false documentation. They've lied on an attestation, or they've, signed a policy with you all that has a sanctions exclusion clause, but they've, somehow done something shady. And that is really the evasion that on the enforcement side we're focused on, is people that are deliberately, misleading Western service providers.
See, Claire, I'm glad you said this because, the press is full of these reports about dark ships, shadow ships, ghost ships, and they're not all evasion. I mean, they could be what you just described, correct?
Right. Yeah. It's a very amorphous term. Again, I've a couple people in industry have told me now they're calculating sort of 600 ships in the ghost fleet, shadow fleet. What's hard is sometimes you're talking about ships that do move Iranian and Venezuelan oil. They are engaged in sanctions evasion activity globally, right? That's sort of their business. And then sometimes I think people are conflating just a ship that operates outside of the Western system, maybe a Chinese ship or, a ship that someone in India has chartered or something like that.
Right.
Actually, can I ask maybe both of you this, because I was asking you offline just briefly, this attestation, from a ship owner's perspective, let's say, who issues it? Who certifies it? No, who?
Well, it depends on the circumstances.
We're fixing, that's what I'm asking. We're fixing a ship to, any oil company, and how does the owner protect himself with this documentation that this is, how does the owner know, who has no relation to the price of oil? He's only there to charge $1 for the carriage of oil. Where is his protection as far as knowing this attestation and where
Christos, the way I would think, and tell me if I'm wrong, Ms. Regulator, I would think that the way it's supposed to work is you ask the person next in line, next to you. So the P&I club asks its member. The ship owner asks its charterer or shipper. Am I correct?
Exactly. It's a chain, and there's no expectation that someone at sort of the end of the chain has gotten something from the beginning of the chain. And again, quite unusually for OFAC, the reason we use the word safe harbor so many times in our guidance is to make very clear to people that we really mean it. So for example, if you talk about a ship owner and a charterer, the expectation would be the ship owner would get from the charter, and I said who issues it. We did publish some sort of sample language people can use. You don't have to use that. Would get an attestation from the charterer that they're not going to use that vessel, to transport oil that's been purchased above the price cap. The expectation from OFAC side, we've said, you have to do the due diligence you already do, right? So you couldn't just stop doing your standard due diligence, but there's not an expectation that you sort of add additional policies and procedures. You just have to get that document and retain that document. And if it comes out later that charterer, they lied to you.
That's the key question.
And you got the document, then you are entitled to safe harbor. You are not going to face an OFAC enforcement.
Okay.
And we will go after the person who lied to you.
Perfect.
And this is where, I mentioned it earlier, this is where the EU differs on the price cap. Under the EU, even a tier 3 player has to have a reasonable expectation that the attestation is valid, which places a burden, I believe, on, for example, P&I clubs and owners that are based in Europe to confirm that maybe that attestation is valid. The problem is, with the EU, doesn't really have a track record of enforcement. So what exactly does that phrase mean, and how is it going to be enforced? Nobody knows. And that's what the owners are scared of.
One thing common to both the EU program and our program here is here you have the executive order, you have the determination call, which implements the executive order, and in the EU you have the EU reg, whichever it is, and then they, a multi-page set of guidance and FAQs. Here the same thing, right? OFAC published tremendous detail, multiple pages of guidance. The guidance, is it law? Is it how it's considered law?
So not exactly. So and also I should preface this by saying I'm the head of compliance, but I'm not a lawyer, more of a banking expert. But OFAC is an administrative agency. We publish, what we call the regulations, which, in this case is the executive order, and that is functionally, what has the force of law in this case. So the determinations pursuant to Executive Order 1404, and then OFAC guidance, is how we give information to the public on how to interpret our regulations and how to comply with them. So FAQs, in this case, the price cap guidance. So just to give kind of an example, I guess, if the way that it works with the sort of safe harbor and the use of the attestations, do you have to, by force of law, get an attestation? No, you don't, right? What you have to do by force of law is not violate OFAC sanctions. So if it ever came out that there was a violation and you did not have the attestation, then you would not be entitled to the sort of safe harbor that we have provided. You wouldn't have really a case to say, well, we did, what you all expected us to. Technically, if you can, somehow make this work without ever collecting any documents and just never violate OFAC sanctions, it's the same way that a bank doesn't have to have an OFAC filter. There's no law that says you have to have a name or system that checks the names on the SDN list. It's just that it's very hard to not have that and then not accidentally violate OFAC sanctions.
No, that's a good point, Claire, because not just in this instance, but OFAC publishes guidance in many different programs. And I always thought the purpose of those was to do although they don't always call them a safe harbor, but to create a safe harbor and a possible mitigation or, a mitigation point if there were a civil investigative proceeding, for example.
That's exactly right.
How do we measure success? The goals of this program were to make sure Russia doesn't profit from the sale of oil and that oil keeps flowing and getting to market. Has anyone measured success so far? How do we do that?
Well, we just hit a little over the year mark of Russia's invasion, and I think that was kind of a point at which not just Treasury, but our allies were sort of taking stock of everything. And notwithstanding, obviously, that, first of all the success so far goes to Ukraine, and they have a very hard road ahead of them. But if you look at this policy, Russia last year made its calculations for its budget based on prices of oil continuing to be high. And so they projected that they would have a budget surplus to continue to fight this war. They do not have that. They have a 47% deficit. And Russian oil revenue, the IEA just announced, I think just last week, that their output has basically stayed the same or is a little bit up. I know they've announced a minor production cost, but we haven't really seen that yet. And their oil revenue is down 60% from where it was in March 2022. And oil prices are stable. So from our perspective, the price cap is working. Russia is earning less money, but the oil is moving.
And Claire, just sitting in the room as your skeptic, good, bad, or indifferent, do we trust numbers, revenue numbers coming out of Russia? Their revenues are up. How do we test those numbers? How do we rely on those numbers?
That's a good question, and admittedly slightly outside of my bailiwick. But this was analysis by the IEA, not by Russia, and I agree that it's very hard to trust the calculations that the Russians put out. Although I will say, multiple high-level Russian officials have admitted that the price cap is hurting their revenue, hurting their ability, to fund the different things they want to do in their economy. And they've sort of taken steps to try and get around it precisely because it is cutting into their revenue.
Enforcement. We're now 3 or 4 months into the program. Are there any enforcement trends on the horizon? What do you see coming?
I mean, we've been, very clear, as I said at the beginning, our enforcement is going to focus on people that deliberately violate the policy, people that lie to our service providers, genuinely bad actors. It's still very early. The timeline for OFAC investigations is quite long. I will say there's been a lot of sort of churn in the press that we don't necessarily see evidence of. There's been this reporting that they're, with high freight rates, the Russians are somehow capturing these high freight rates and they're, in the middle of it. And people keep saying this to me at conferences without any evidence of it. We don't see that. We don't see evidence of that. But it's something we're monitoring very closely. We work really closely with our coalition partners to exchange information, and continue to monitor this.
Actually, John, can I just follow up on that 1 second? So if I was reading about this recently where a lot of Russian oil is going to North Africa, more than their domestic requirements require, and they're saying a lot of it's getting stored and then re-exported to Europe. I'm assuming, and I have no idea, is that an OFAC violation? Is it okay once it hits a storage, gets blended a little bit with something else? Because I know it's primarily not to be the same molecules. It's confusing. Again, I'm sorry, but from commercial side, all this stuff is just so confusing.
No, it's a good question. So the rules with the price cap are basically, it has to go, if it's crude oil, it has to be taken on shore, and the price cap has to apply through the first landed sale. If somebody takes crude oil on shore and then refines it.
No, export's crude.
Sorry?
If they export the crude.
If you export crude, if it goes back out on the water, so let's say somebody brings crude oil into a tank somewhere, right? And it goes back out on the water without being substantially transformed, it is still subject to the price cap. And, then you get into questions of the European ban. So I'm not a European customs expert, but you couldn't, just take crude, park it in a tank somewhere, and then bring it into Europe. That would still, violate their import ban.
But the owner would not have to get an attestation to load Tunisia to Italy. That's the confusing part, because he's fixed to, a BC company. And again, I'm just looking from my perspective and what we're seeing, because there's a lot of these questions. And I don't know how insurers come in and all that, but this phenomenon we're talking about. All of a sudden you're storing Russian oil, sanctioned, assuming sanctioned, which is why you're doing it, taking it and then exporting it. There's no reason for a ship owner to get an attestation to load Tunisia to Italy.
Yeah, but at the end of the day, Christos, there is somebody who knows that is Russian oil sitting in that tank.
Agreed.
Whether it's a seller, supplier, whatever it is. So if that person knows that is Russian oil that has not been altered in any way, then they must pass on that information down the line. So the ship owner, even if it's going from Tunisia, let's say, to somewhere
Italy,
else, has to be made aware of that.
But let's say he's not. He gets in trouble. I mean,
He's protected by the safe harbor.
So we could sit here for 4 hours and talk about this. It's a wonderful topic. But this panel's carriage is about to turn into a pumpkin. It's 11:15. But if anyone has a question that they want to raise publicly now to any of our panel members, I'm sure they would be happy to answer.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
If the war were to end, what would the dark fleet, how would the dark fleet be treated by OFAC? Would they be allowed
Great question.
Would they be allowed to re-enter into mainstream trades and receive, if they receive normal G77?
I think, the short answer is it depends. When you say re-enter, if you're, and again, this is the question about what do we mean by dark fleet? Do we mean a Chinese-owned old ship that didn't violate the price cap in the sense that they weren't at any point lying to a Western service provider, that's kind of up to the Western service providers. If they want to, I don't know how excited you would be to give a policy to a 20-year-old Aframax, but in terms of what we've seen, though, is a lot of the dark fleet is engaged in other sanctions evasion activity, moving Venezuelan oil, moving Iranian oil, and those sanction programs are very much still in place, and we're continuing, to take action in those programs.
If I can presume an answer to that question, though, unless a particular vessel or that vessel owner is actually sanctioned, put on a blocked list by OFAC, there's nothing to prevent that particular owner or that particular vessel to trade anywhere.
I can answer also from the commercial side. The oil companies will look at your last 10 cargoes, and if, say, to your point, it stops tomorrow and the last 10 cargoes have been sanctioned Russian trade, no one will touch you. So you'll be de facto, again, this goes to that word de facto sanction, where if you can't trade in the open market because you've been trading this business, it better be lucrative enough for you to say, after that, I'm not doing anything.
And the same goes for P&I clubs. We have due diligence procedures. Every new potential member that's going to come in or any inquiry has to go through a background check. There's a lot of information that's requested. So chances are, as Christos says, it would show something that would not be of interest to a P&I club to take on.
Anyone else? One more?
Just thinking that the easiest way to sell the vessel, you pay all that money, and then for the new owner of the vessel, they will not be required to declare any past and voyages.
No, you have to. We have ship owners. When we sell ships, we get voyage history, which goes to the new owner, goes to the P&I clubs, vessel logs, cargo history. All those go in. Now you're going to tell me they're all false. Great. So guess what? You have to discount it for somebody now to take it.
Maybe the new owner will not really care because, let's say,
Then he's not trading in the open market. We have ship owners in this audience, and they know they can't sell a ship that doesn't have, if they can't show a booklet like this that says, here's my history.
if there are certain buyers for certain vessels only.
But then they're going back into that sanction trade. So, yeah.
So, and then, just to say that the people who make all that money by not following the rules will have the chance to buy new vessels and trade them with clear.
Yeah.
So,
Please, actually, perfect here. We have an audit.
I still feel like people maybe haven't listened clearly enough to Claire. When we're talking about dark fleet, dark break, that is not people who are trading on. When people say 600 ships, they're talking about people who are trading under the price cap, which is legal. They can, once the price cap regime goes away, they'll continue to trade.
Right.
You're talking about, non-Western tonnage. If they're trading differently and trading legally, then yes, they're commercial. There could be commercial barriers.
Right.
right,
But you have
so-
attestations.
If you're talking about somebody who, is trading under the price cap, but it turns out the ship's actually owned by an SDN, then that's a different part of OFAC that's running. If you're talking about somebody who buys or sells and doesn't do the checks against AIS, and there are these other violations, and they're also, those are other parts of OFAC. But the sloppiest thing that I feel like I'm seeing here, just in general, when I pick up trade winds, is that there are 600 ships that are doing sanctioned activities right now.
Yeah, and I'd like to add something to that because that's an excellent point that you're making. Sure.
So we're Bridgeport, we've been selling a lot of older ships. So our concern is, vetting the buyers. And so you run your Lloyd's Sea Searcher and you get 6 red flags that pop up, and they flag anything that touches Russia. So you're selling to someone, they've been trading Russia. You ask for all this documentation, you get it, and they're not dark fleet, and they're not. If they continue to do that, I don't see them having any trouble coming back into the fold when this is done, and it is lucrative.
Right.
So, hold on.
Even
Christos.
sanctioned trade and non-sanctioned trade is very lucrative.
So we have to give up this room. Unfortunately, I can see people starting to stand in the back. I want to thank Claire and Christos and Dan for their participation today, and for Nicholas, and the Capital Link people for thinking to put this panel together. I think I really do appreciate each of your participation. And Claire, thanks for coming up for this.